Red and blue lights fractured the quiet midnight highway. A decorated war hero forced out of his vehicle on a desolate stretch of road stood silently as a crooked badge mocked the medals he'd bled for. But the arrogant officer had no idea who was sitting in the back seat. The rain had been coming down in a relentless icy sheet for hours by the time the black Chevy Tahoe rolled through the desolate stretches of Stafford County, Virginia. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the rhythmic, hypnotic sweeping of the windshield wipers and the low, steady hum of the heater. Behind the wheel sat Elias Crow, a man carved from mahogany and granite, his posture rigid and disciplined despite the deep, aching exhaustion settling into his bones. His eyes, dark and weathered by decades of things civilian eyes were never meant to see, remained locked on the slick, treacherous asphalt ahead. Elias was a retired Army Ranger, a man who had given the best years of his life and a portion of his physical body to the uniform. Tonight, he was dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored civilian suit, but the passenger seat beside him held the true weight of his legacy. Resting carefully on the leather was a custom glass-front shadow box. Inside it, pinned to navy blue velvet, rested a silver star, a purple heart, and a combat infantryman badge. They were pristine, gleaming faintly in the passing glow of the occasional street lamp. It had been a brutal day. Elias had spent the afternoon at Arlington National Cemetery burying Sergeant Tyler Boone, a man who had breathed his last breath in Elias's arms years prior, only to succumb to a different kind of war back home. The funeral had drained everyone, especially the man currently sleeping in the deeply tinted back seat of the Tahoe, Lieutenant General Nathaniel Voss. Voss was a 3-star general who commanded fear, respect, and awe in equal measure across the Pentagon. He was also a man who owed his life to Elias Crow. Years ago, in the blistering, unforgiving heat of a Fallujah ambush, Elias had dragged a then-Colonel Voss out of a burning Humvee, taking a barrage of shrapnel to his right leg in the process. The injury had ultimately cost Elias his leg below the knee, replacing flesh and bone with titanium and carbon fiber. Voss had never forgotten. Their bond transcended rank. They were brothers forged in the absolute worst of human conditions. Voss had asked Elias to drive him today, needing the quiet companionship of the only man who truly understood the weight of the coffin they had just lowered into the earth. As the Tahoe navigated a dark curve on Highway 17, Elias adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, wincing slightly as the dull, phantom ache in his missing limb flared up in the damp weather. He tapped the brakes gently to maintain a conservative speed well below the limit. He was a cautious driver, hyper-aware of the optics of being a broad-shouldered black man, driving a late-model, heavily tinted SUV through a rural county in the dead of night. But caution, it seemed, was not enough. In the rearview mirror, a sudden, violent explosion of red and blue lights shattered the darkness. The strobing reflections bounced off the wet asphalt, accompanied by the short, aggressive whoop-whoop of a police siren. Elias's jaw tightened. He glanced at his speedometer. He checked his mirrors. He was perfectly centered in his lane. There was absolutely no traffic infraction to warrant a stop. He let out a slow, controlled breath, tapping the brakes and pulling the heavy SUV smoothly onto the wide gravel shoulder. He placed the vehicle in park, rolled down his window, turned off the engine, and placed both of his large hands at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. It was a routine born of survival. "Everything all right, Elias?" A deep, gravelly voice murmured from the shadows of the back seat. General Voss was awake, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. "Just a traffic stop, sir," Elias replied, his voice calm, steady, and devoid of panic. "Go back to sleep. I'll handle it. Probably just a checkpoint or a bored deputy." "Mm-hmm," Voss grunted, shifting his weight. "Wake me if it takes more than a few minutes." Outside in the freezing rain, Officer Vance Harlow slammed the door of his cruiser. Harlow was a man whose high school glory days as a mediocre linebacker had been seamlessly replaced by the unearned authority of a tin badge. He was notorious in the local precinct for his aggressive traffic stops, his puffed-out chest, and his absolute intolerance for anyone who didn't immediately bow to his presence. To Harlow, the badge wasn't a shield to protect the community. It was a hammer, and everyone else was a nail. Harlow strutted toward the Tahoe, his heavy boots crunching against the wet gravel. He unsnapped the retention strap on his holster, a completely unnecessary intimidation tactic, and unclipped his heavy-duty maglite. He didn't approach the window directly. Instead, he lingered near the rear quarter panel, shining the blinding beam of the flashlight through the rain, attempting to pierce the deep tint of the rear windows and seeing nothing but his own reflection. He aggressively slapped his palm against the rear passenger door, a blatant move designed to startle the occupants, before stepping up to the driver's window. Elias didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, waiting. Harlow shoved the blinding flashlight beam directly into Elias's face, holding it just inches from the glass. "License, registration, and insurance. Now." "Good evening, officer," Elias said, his voice polite but firm, refusing to squint against the harsh light. "My wallet is in my suit jacket pocket on my left side. My registration is in the glove compartment. With your permission, I am going to reach for them." Harlow scoffed, leaning closer, the smell of cheap coffee and stale chewing tobacco wafting into the cabin. "I didn't ask for a speech, boy. I told you to hand over your papers and make it quick. You're making me stand in the damn rain." Elias's knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel at the word boy, but his discipline held. He slowly reached into his breast pocket, retrieving his leather wallet, and then stretched over to pop the glove box. As he leaned over, Harlow's sweeping flashlight beam caught the passenger seat. The beam stopped. It illuminated the shadow box, the silver star, the purple heart. A cruel, twisted smirk slowly formed on Officer Harlow's face. Harlow lowered the flashlight just enough so Elias could see the sneer plastered across his face. He snatched the license and registration from Elias's hand, barely glancing at the names before his eyes locked back onto the shadow box resting on the leather seat. "Well, well, well," Harlow drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "What do we have here? You a collector?" "Those are my personal effects, officer," Elias said evenly. "Was I speeding? I had my cruise control set below the limit." Harlow ignored the question entirely. He leaned his upper body through the window, water dripping from the brim of his campaign hat onto Elias's suit sleeve. He pointed the flashlight directly at the medals. "Silver Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman," Harlow recited, shaking his head. "That's some heavy hardware. Where'd you pick that up? Military surplus store in Richmond? Or did you buy it off eBay to impress the ladies at the bar?" Elias's posture stiffened. The air inside the cabin suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "I earned those in the Al Anbar province, officer, years ago. Now, if you could please tell me why I was pulled over." Harlow let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You? Al Anbar? Please. I know guys who actually served. Real patriots. Guys who didn't need to dress up their passenger seat with fake jewelry to feel like men. Stolen valor is a crime. You know that, right?" "There is no stolen valor here," Elias replied, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the dangerous, quiet rumble of an incoming storm. I spent 2 decades in the United States Army. I was honorably discharged. If you run my name, you'll see it. If you have a citation to write, write it. Otherwise, we are going to be on our way. The defiance in Elias's tone was unacceptable to a man like Vance Harlow. In his mind, he was the absolute ruler of this stretch of highway. How dare this man who looked like Elias, driving a car nicer than Harlow could ever afford, speak to him with such calm authority? "You don't tell me when you're on your way, pal," Harlow spat, taking a step back and resting his hand aggressively on the butt of his service weapon. "You were swerving back there, crossing the center line. Smells like alcohol in this car to me. I haven't had a drop of alcohol in years," Elias stated, his eyes narrowing. "And I did not cross the line. My dashcam has been recording since we left Arlington." The mention of a camera made Harlow's face flush purple with rage. He hated cameras. They ruined his narrative. "Step out of the vehicle," Harlow barked. "Officer, I am perfectly compliant right here. There is no need—" "I said step the hell out of the car," Harlow roared, ripping the door handle. The Tahoe's doors automatically unlocked when in park, and Harlow yanked the heavy door open, exposing Elias to the freezing downpour. "Out? Now. We're doing a field sobriety test, and then I'm confiscating that fake junk on your seat as evidence of fraud." Elias let out a slow, measured breath. He knew the protocol. He knew that out here in the dark, a badge was a shield for terrible men. "Officer Harlow," Elias said, reading the man's name tag. "I will step out, but I need you to know I am an amputee. I have a prosthetic right leg. I need a moment to pivot and plant my footing on the wet gravel so I do not fall." "Stop stalling," Harlow yelled. He didn't care about a prosthetic. He only saw a man defying his timeline. Harlow reached in, grabbing Elias by the shoulder of his expensive suit, and yanked hard. The sudden, violent pull threw Elias off balance. As he tried to swing his prosthetic leg out of the door frame, his carbon fiber foot slipped on the wet metal running board. Elias stumbled, catching himself with his massive hands against the doorframe, preventing a fall into the mud. "I told you I needed a second to plant my foot," Elias growled, his military bearing slipping just a fraction, revealing the lethal infantryman beneath the suit. Harlow took the stumble as a sign of resistance. "Stop resisting. Put your hands on the roof of the car." "I am not resisting," Elias said loudly, complying and placing his large hands flat on the wet roof of the Tahoe. "I am disabled." "You're a liar, is what you are," Harlow sneered, moving in close, aggressively kicking Elias's ankles apart. He kicked the carbon fiber prosthetic, jarring Elias's residual limb and sending a spike of blinding pain up his thigh. Elias gritted his teeth, refusing to make a sound of discomfort. Harlow patted him down roughly, finding nothing. Frustrated that he didn't have a weapon to charge him with, Harlow's eyes darted back to the interior of the car. The shadow box. "I'm sick of you fakes," Harlow muttered. He stepped away from Elias, leaned into the Tahoe, and grabbed the shadow box from the passenger seat. "Do not touch that," Elias warned, his voice suddenly sharp, echoing like a gunshot over the rain. "Or what?" Harlow challenged, pulling the box out into the rain. He held it up by the edges. "You're going to call your fake commanding officer? This is contraband as far as I'm concerned." "Officer Harlow," Elias said, every muscle in his back coiled tighter than a steel spring. "The man who pinned that silver star on my chest is a lieutenant general in the United States Army. If you drop that box, you will cross a line you cannot uncross." Harlow laughed, a nasty, victorious sound. "A lieutenant general? Wow, you're really committed to the delusion. Tell you what, let's see how real this hardware is." Harlow intentionally fumbled his grip, The heavy glass shadow box slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the wet, rocky shoulder of the highway. The sound of shattering glass pierced the night. The velvet backing tumbled into the mud, the silver star, stained with the grit of the road, skittered under the Tahoe's tire. Elias froze. He stared at the shattered glass, the ruined velvet, the medals he had bled for, now sitting in the Virginia mud. A terrifying, absolute silence fell over him. I wasn't looking at a police officer anymore. He was looking at an enemy combatant. "Oops," Harlow mocked, grinning ear to ear. "Looks like you'll have to go back to the pawn shop. Now turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicion of DUI." And Harlow's words were violently cut short. Not by Elias, but by the sound of a heavy, solid click. The rear passenger door of the Tahoe swung open. The rain seemed to stop mattering. The world shrank to the heavy, deliberate thud of a polished military dress boot hitting the wet asphalt. Officer Harlow froze, his handcuffs dangling from his fingers. He stared as a massive figure emerged from the pitch-black cavern of the SUV's rear seat. Lieutenant General Nathaniel Voss stood up to his full height. He was not in civilian clothes. He had been coming from a full military honors funeral. Voss was wearing his immaculate Army service uniform, the dark blue jacket, the crisp white shirt, and on his shoulders, catching the strobing red and blue lights of the police cruiser, were the 3 brilliant silver stars of a lieutenant general. His chest was a wall of ribbons, a visual history of 4 decades of relentless, brutal service to his country. But it wasn't the uniform that made Officer Harlow's blood run instantly cold. It was the look on the general's face. Voss's eyes were like glacial ice, radiating a predatory, focused rage that was so intense it felt physical. He did not rush. He did not yell. He closed the car door behind him with a quiet, terrifying click, and took 2 measured steps toward the rear of the vehicle, coming face to face with Vance Harlow. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound was the patter of rain on the general's shoulders. Harlow swallowed hard. His arrogant smirk had vanished, replaced by a pale, sickening dread. He tried to speak, to assert his authority, but the words died in his throat. His brain recognized the rank, recognized the undeniable aura of a man who commanded tens of thousands of actual warriors. "I was sleeping, officer." Voss's voice sliced through the air. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a baritone weight that demanded absolute submission. "I was sleeping because I spent the afternoon burying a man who died because his lungs were destroyed by burn pits in a war zone he volunteered for." Harlow took a half-step back, his hand nervously twitching near his belt. "Sir, he was driving erratically." "Silence," Voss commanded. The word hit Harlow like a physical blow. Voss's eyes slowly drifted downward, taking in the shattered glass on the ground. He looked at the mud-stained velvet. He saw the silver star lying near the tire. A muscle in Voss's jaw feathered. When he looked back up at Harlow, the temperature in the air seemed to plummet. "I pinned that medal on his chest," Voss said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I pinned it on him in a field hospital in Germany. I pinned it on him while he was in a medically induced coma after he carried me for miles on his back with a piece of shrapnel the size of a golf ball lodged in his femur." Voss took a step forward, invading Harlow's space, towering over the bully. "He lost his leg so that I could keep my life," Voss continued, the ice in his voice cracking to reveal the inferno beneath. "He served 20 years. He is a ranger. He is an American hero. And you, a man wearing a badge you clearly view as a license to terrorize, Just dragged him into the mud and smashed his honor because you felt inadequate. Listen to me, buddy. Harlow tried to regain control, puffing his chest, realizing he was losing the power dynamic entirely. I don't care who you are. This is my stop. This is my jurisdiction. You step back into that vehicle, or I'll arrest you for interfering with a police investigation. It was the wrong thing to say. It was the worst possible thing he could have said. Voss didn't blink. He reached slowly into the inside breast pocket of his dress coat. Harlow flinched, his hand dropping to his gun, but Voss simply pulled out a sleek black smartphone. My name is Lieutenant General Nathaniel Voss, he said, holding the officer's gaze while dialing a number from memory. I am the Deputy Commanding General of the United States Army Forces Command. I report directly to the Pentagon, and you are about to have the worst night of your pathetic, miserable life. Harlow's bravado shattered. The color drained from his face completely. He looked from Voss to the calm, stoic face of Elias, who was still standing by the car, and back to the shattered medals on the ground. The reality of the situation crashed into him like a freight train. He hadn't just pulled over the wrong guy. He had humiliated a war hero in front of a commanding general. Voss put the phone to his ear. It rang twice. This is General Voss, he spoke into the phone, his eyes never leaving Harlow's terrified face. Get me the State Police Superintendent for Virginia now. Wake him up. Tell him I have a rogue, out-of-control local officer assaulting a disabled veteran on Highway 17, and if state troopers aren't here immediately, I will call the governor directly. Harlow held up his hands, shaking. His heavy mag light trembled in his grip. Sir. General, please. Let's just calm down. There's been a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Voss slowly lowered the phone from his ear, though the line remained connected. He looked down at Harlow with a disgust so profound it stripped the officer of every ounce of his unearned pride. You didn't know? Voss echoed softly. You didn't know he was a hero? That doesn't matter, officer, because you thought he was just a regular citizen. You thought he was just a man you could abuse without consequence. Your badge doesn't give you the right to be a tyrant. It gives you the burden of being a shield. And you are no shield. Voss pointed a stiff, uncompromising finger at the muddy ground. Pick them up, the general ordered. Harlow blinked, rain dripping from his nose. What? You heard me? Voss barked, the command echoing off the wet asphalt. Get on your knees in the mud, pick up the glass, pick up the velvet, and pick up the metal you aren't worthy to look at, let alone touch. Harlow stood paralyzed, his mind racing, trapped between his massive ego and the absolute, terrifying authority of the man standing before him. Do it, Voss whispered softly, or I will personally ensure you never wear a uniform of any kind in any jurisdiction for the rest of your natural life. Slowly, his hands shaking in humiliation, Officer Vance Harlow dropped to his knees in the freezing Virginia mud. The freezing Virginia rain continued to fall, turning the highway shoulder into a slick, freezing mire. Officer Vance Harlow, a man who had built his entire identity on intimidation and unearned authority, knelt in that very mud. His heavy-duty belt dragged against the wet gravel. His hands, usually quick to grab a weapon or shove a civilian, were now shaking violently as he reached down to pick up the shattered pieces of the shadow box. He moved slowly, his mind completely fractured by the sheer gravity of his mistake. The glass was the shards jagged from the violent impact. As Harlow picked up a particularly large piece of the shattered casing, the edge sliced into the pad of his index finger. A bright drop of crimson welled up, mixing with the muddy water running over his hands. He hissed in pain, instinctively pulling his hand back. "Keep going," Lieutenant General Nathaniel Voss ordered. The general had not moved an inch. He stood in the pouring rain, his dress uniform absorbing the downpour, his posture as rigid as a marble statue. "Every piece. You broke a man's legacy because you could not control your own ego. You will gather every single shard." Elias Crow watched in silence. The simmering anger that had tightened his chest just minutes prior had dissolved into a profound, heavy sorrow. He looked at the Purple Heart, its ribbon soaked in dirty water, and thought of the hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, where Voss had pinned it to his hospital gown. He thought of the phantom pain that still shot through his missing limb every morning. He didn't feel triumph watching Harlow humiliate himself. He only felt a deep exhaustion at the reality that men like this still wore badges. "General," Elias spoke up, his voice calm and rumbling over the sound of the rain. "Leave him be. The point is made. He isn't worth the mud on your boots." Voss looked at Elias, the icy fury in the general's eyes softening for just a fraction of a second when he looked at his friend. But when his gaze snapped back to Harlow, the ice returned. "No, Elias. Men like this rely on the grace of better men to escape consequences. Tonight, there is no grace." Before Harlow could formulate a pathetic plea for mercy, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. It wasn't just one siren, it was a chorus. Within moments, the dark highway was illuminated by a blinding storm of flashing blue lights. 4 Virginia State Police cruisers came tearing down the asphalt, hydroplaning slightly before swerving onto the shoulder and boxing in Harlow's lone local patrol car. The doors of the cruisers flew open simultaneously. Out stepped half a dozen state troopers, moving with a synchronized tactical urgency that made Harlow's sloppy policing look like a joke. Leading them was Captain Wesley Thorne, a long-serving veteran of the state police, his face set in a grim, uncompromising scowl. Thorne took one look at the scene. A local cop on his knees bleeding into the mud, a massive stoic black man in a tailored suit leaning against a Tahoe, and a highly decorated 3-star general standing in the rain, radiating absolute authority. "General Voss," Captain Thorne said, marching straight past the kneeling Harlow and offering a sharp, crisp salute. "Superintendent sent me directly. The area is secured. What is the situation, sir?" Voss returned the salute slowly. "Captain Thorne, this local officer initiated an illegal, retaliatory traffic stop. He assaulted my driver, a disabled combat veteran, and intentionally destroyed military decorations out of spite. I then attempted to escalate to an unlawful arrest to cover his tracks." Harlow scrambled to his feet, his knees coated in thick brown sludge. He looked desperately at Thorne, trying to invoke the unspoken brotherhood of the badge. "Captain, listen to me. They're twisting this. The driver was erratic. I smelled alcohol. I was conducting a standard, lawful investigation." "Shut your mouth, Harlow," Thorne barked, not even turning to look at him. Thorne knew Harlow's reputation. The local precinct had received dozens of complaints about him over the years, mostly from minorities and out-of-town drivers. But the local union always protected him. Now the idiot had finally stepped on a landmine he couldn't bully his way out of. "He claims he smelled alcohol," Voss said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "My driver has not consumed alcohol in years. Furthermore, the entire incident, including his unprovoked physical assault on Elias, is recorded on the vehicle's front and rear dash cameras." Harlow's stomach completely dropped out. He hadn't noticed the rear-facing camera tucked behind the Tahoe's tinted glass. Every threat, every slur, the physical yank, the destruction of the metals, It was all in high-definition video with crisp audio. "Captain," Voss continued, his tone shifting from angry to commanding, "I want this man disarmed. I want his body camera seized immediately before the footage accidentally corrupts, and I want him detained for deprivation of rights under color of law." Thorne nodded sharply. He turned to two of his massive state troopers. "Trooper Soto, Trooper Byrne, strip his belt, seize the body cam, put him in the back of my cruiser." Wait, you can't do this," Harlow panicked, backing up until he hit the side of his own patrol car. "I have rights. I'm a sworn officer of Stafford County." "Not tonight, you're not," Thorne said coldly. The two troopers closed in. They didn't ask nicely. They grabbed Harlow by his shoulders, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the wet hood of his cruiser. Harlow gasped as Trooper Soto unclipped his duty belt, the heavy leather and holstered Glock dropping to the wet pavement with a pathetic thud. Trooper Byrne reached up and unclipped the Axon body camera from Harlow's chest, placing it carefully into an evidence bag. Harlow was hyperventilating, the reality of his destroyed career crashing down on him. The power trip was over. As the troopers wrenched his arms behind his back and clicked a pair of state-issued handcuffs around his wrists, Harlow looked over his shoulder. Elias Crow was kneeling quietly in the mud, carefully picking up the dirtied silver star. The veteran didn't look angry. He just looked disappointed. And to a narcissist like Harlow, that absolute indifference was worse than a beating. The fallout was not merely local. It was seismic. By sunrise, General Voss had leveraged the very pinnacle of his command to ensure the incident was not quietly buried by a friendly local police chief. The high-definition dashcam footage from Elias's Tahoe, complete with crystal-clear audio of the entire illegal stop, was handed directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice. General Voss bypassed the Stafford County precinct entirely, knowing full well how local corruption operated. When the footage leaked to the national press days later, the country absolutely erupted. The video was a masterclass in poetic justice. It broadcasted Elias's calm, terrifyingly disciplined compliance, which contrasted brilliantly against Harlow's unhinged, fragile ego. Millions of viewers watched the bully kick a disabled veteran's prosthetic leg and shatter a Purple Heart in the mud. But the moment that truly broke the internet, the cinematic twist that left the public cheering at their screens, was the sudden, silent emergence of a three-star general from the shadows of the back seat. Stepping out to completely obliterate the corrupt cop's power trip, hard karma did not just knock on Vance Harlow's door, it kicked the door off its hinges with federal boots. The DOJ Civil Rights Division, spearheaded by a ruthless, meticulous federal prosecutor named Nathaniel Crow, descended on Stafford County. Harlow's egregious assault on Elias was the catalyst, but Crow used it to crack open a massive, rotting Pandora's box. Early one morning, a fleet of black SUVs surrounded the local precinct. FBI agents marched through the double doors with federal warrants, seizing servers, physical files, and years of body cam footage. They discovered a horrifying systemic pattern. Harlow had not just made one mistake in the dark. He had spent years intentionally targeting Black and Hispanic drivers, fabricating charges, planting minor evidence to justify vehicle seizures, and terrorizing vulnerable citizens who didn't have the money to fight back in court. He had built a kingdom of petty tyranny. But because he finally decided to assault a federally recognized disabled combat veteran, chauffeuring a top-ranking Pentagon official, his kingdom was burned to ash. Crow brought down the federal hammer. Harlow was not just fired, he was publicly indicted by a federal grand jury. The consequences bled rapidly into Harlow's personal life. The morning the federal indictment was unsealed, Harlow sat in his living room, pale and shaking, while FBI agents boxed up his personal computer. His wife, Amara, having watched the dashcam footage on the evening news, was thoroughly disgusted by the revelation of her husband's cowardice. She packed her bags, took their dog, and walked out the front door while the agents were still searching the kitchen. She filed for divorce the next day. Furthermore, the local police union, seeing the absolute toxicity of the PR nightmare and the undeniable federal evidence, publicly disavowed Harlow. They revoked his membership and refused to contribute a single cent to his legal defense fund. The federal trial, held months later, was a media circus. Harlow, stripped of his uniform, his badge, and his arrogant swagger, was forced to wear an oversized drab orange jumpsuit. He sat at the defense table looking incredibly small, flanked by an overworked public defender because he could no longer afford private counsel. The star witness for the prosecution was Elias Crow. When Elias took the stand, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, the packed courtroom fell utterly silent. The defense attorney attempted a desperate cross-examination, trying to paint Harlow as a stressed officer making a split-second decision in the dark on a dangerous highway. "Mr. Crow," the defense attorney pleaded, "isn't it true that in the dark, with the rain pouring down, Officer Harlow might have reasonably mistaken your movements as aggressive?" Elias leaned forward into the microphone. His voice was calm, deep, and resonated with the devastating authority of a man who knew what actual combat looked like. "There was no split-second decision, counselor. I told him my hands were on the wheel. I told him I was an amputee. He took his time. He enjoyed dragging me into the mud. He did not act out of fear. He acted out of malice." The jury didn't need to deliberate long. It took them only a short while to return a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Percival Hale, a jurist renowned for her absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding police corruption and abuse of authority, did not hold back during the sentencing hearing. She stared down from the bench, her eyes piercing right through the disgraced officer. "Mr. Harlow, you were granted a badge and a gun to protect the innocent," Judge Hale stated, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous federal courtroom. "Instead, you weaponized the law to hunt them. You saw a disabled American hero and decided he was prey. You operated under the delusion that a piece of tin on your chest made you a god on the highway. You are a coward and a profound disgrace to the thousands of brave men and women who wear the uniform with actual honor. The court will ensure you never possess authority over another human being again." Harlow wept openly, burying his face in his trembling hands as the gavel fell. He was sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for severe civil rights violations, assault under color of law, and falsifying official reports. He would serve every single minute of it in protective custody, a disgraced ex-cop locked in a solitary cage, entirely stripped of the power he had abused for so long. Weeks after Harlow was transferred to a federal lockup in Pennsylvania, a vastly different scene unfolded in Washington, D.C. Inside the Pentagon, within a highly secure wood-paneled briefing room overlooking the Potomac River, Elias Crow stood tall. His posture was flawless, a physical testament to a lifetime of discipline. Surrounding him were 24 of the highest-ranking military officials in the United States Armed Forces. Standing directly in front of him was Lieutenant General Nathaniel Voss. In Voss's hands was a brand-new, custom-crafted shadow box. It was a masterpiece of dark, polished mahogany, reinforced glass, and brass fittings. Inside, resting perfectly on immaculate deep navy blue velvet, was a pristine silver star, a gleaming purple heart, and a freshly minted combat infantryman badge. "Master Sergeant Crow," Voss said, his voice thick with raw emotion, echoing in the otherwise silent room. "A few months ago, a corrupt coward attempted to strip you of your honor in the mud on a dark highway. He failed, because honor is not a piece of metal pinned to a jacket. Honor is the man who wears it." Voss stepped forward, his eyes locking with Elias's, and presented the heavy wooden box. Elias reached out, his massive hands gripping the polished mahogany. He looked down through the glass, his dark eyes reflecting the brilliant gleam of the newly issued medals. "These replacements were authorized directly by the Secretary of the Army," Voss continued, stepping back and snapping his heels together into a rigid position of absolute attention. "On behalf of a deeply grateful nation, and a brother whose life you saved on the worst day of his life, thank you." General Voss raised his right hand in a razor-sharp, flawless salute. Behind the general, every single officer in the room, 4-star generals, colonels, and command sergeants major, snapped to attention in perfect synchronization. The sound of their polished boots hitting the floor echoed like a thunderclap. They raised their hands, forming a silent, powerful wall of respect for a man who had never asked for recognition, only for peace. Elias looked at the assembled brass, looked down at the medals resting in his hands, and slowly, proudly returned the salute. Hundreds of miles away, in a cramped, eternally damp concrete cell block, Vance Harlow sat on a thin, uncomfortable mattress. A small, caged television mounted high on the wall in the common area was playing the evening news broadcast. Through the grainy static, Harlow watched the high-definition footage of the private Pentagon ceremony. He watched the black man he had called a liar, the veteran he had shoved into the freezing Virginia mud, receiving the absolute highest honors the military elite could bestow. Harlow looked slowly down at his own hands resting in his lap. They were completely empty. He had no badge. He had no gun. He had no authority, no wife, and no future. I was just an inmate, a hollow number in a brutal system entirely forgotten by the world outside his steel door. The ultimate power reversal was complete. The arrogant bully had been securely caged in his own misery, and the silent hero had rightfully reclaimed the light. If you felt the satisfying sting of justice in this story, don't forget to hit that like button right now. Stories like this prove that true honor can never be broken by a bully's badge. Share this video with someone who loves a hard-hitting karma comeback, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next explosive true-life drama. Let us know in the comments what you think Harlow's worst punishment really was.